Hello, I'm Mr. Furlong, and today we're going to talk about the structure of DNA and its cousin, RNA. Today we're going to take a look at the structure of DNA, and we'll also talk about the structure of RNA as well. You can see spinning next to me is a molecule of DNA, a very small molecule of DNA. Let's get started with some of the basics. DNA is short for deoxyribonucleic acid. Remember that DNA is a type of nucleic acid, and it has the sugar deoxyribose in it, hence the name deoxyribonucleic acid. Let's use an analogy for DNA. And let's say that DNA is like a giant book. There it is, the book of life. And just like a book, it's just filled with a bunch of letters that are arranged in such a way to form words, and those words are arranged in such a way that it forms ideas, and we can learn from those ideas. So too is the DNA. The DNA has the ability to store information just like the book. We can copy information from that book, and we can transmit information from the book to, say, a person. Or in the case of DNA, information can be transmitted from one person to another. These are the three most important functions of DNA. And again, a book can do all of these things. For instance, if we take this big book of life and we need to carry out diffusion, for instance, well, all that information is stored in the DNA. When cell respiration is occurring, which is all the time, by the way, all that information as to how that takes place is stored in the DNA. When cells need to divide through mitosis, it gets its information from the DNA. Again, the DNA is kind of like this big book of life, where it has the ability to not only store the information, but we can copy the information, and this information can be transmitted to other organisms. Well, let's look at the structure of DNA. First of all, the two people that get most of the credit for discovering it are two scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick. There you can see their pictures. And of course, they used not only evidence that they were collecting at the time, this is the early 1950s, 1950, 1951, and there were many groups of scientists that were trying to find the structure of DNA. They used their evidence, along with evidence from other scientists, to come up with this structure. These are two of the biggest names in all of the history of biology, which means you are going to need to remember who they are. In fact, they are such famous scientists that bobbleheads have been made in their likeness. That's cool. Well, let's take a look at some of this evidence. So there was a scientist, a guy by the name of Chargaff, who was looking at the nucleotides found in DNA. Now, at this point, scientists have shown that it really was DNA that hereditary information was being stored in and transferred from parent to offspring. And so he was looking at, in a variety of different types of organisms, the amount of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. This is just a small sampling of the numbers that he has. And you can see that the amount of adenine and thymine are always the same. The amount of guanine and cytosine are all the same. And so the analysis from this that Watson and Crick was able to get from was, first of all, that there are 4 nucleotides found in DNA: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, or what we just abbreviate A, T, C, and G. And that because the A's and T's are always found in the same amount and the C's and the G's were always found in the same amount, that this was not by coincidence. And so Watson and Crick hypothesized that A's and T's somehow have to pair together, and that the C's and the G's paired together. But they didn't know how. Down the road in England, Watson and Crick were in London. In Cambridge, there was another group of scientists, Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin, although working separately. We're also trying to find the structure of DNA. Well, in Rosalind Franklin's laboratory, which you can see the picture of, she was doing something called X-ray crystallography, and she was getting some pictures like this. Watson happened to be visiting Maurice Wilkins, and Maurice Wilkins shared this photo with Watson. And so he took it back and started realizing that he now knows the structure of DNA. Well, let's take a close look at this. So what you're seeing here is, in this picture, we can clearly make out an X pattern. Now, if you look closely at the DNA, you can see an X pattern. It doesn't really show up well on this picture, does it? But the top of the X, we can sort of point it out over there, the bottom of the X over here, and vice versa. The top of the X with this one would match up over here, and the bottom of the X would match up with that one right there. Anyways, so we see this nice X-shaped structure in the DNA. From this picture, Watson and Crick were able to deduce what the structure of the DNA molecule was. So they now know that the sides were made up of the sugars, the deoxyribose and the phosphates, that there were two strands and they were spiraling together, and that the bases face one another, which went against what another group of scientists in the United States was thinking as to how these bases arrange themselves. And so they built their model, and this is the famous picture of Watson and Crick with their DNA model that they made. Literally, it's made using ring stands and cardboard and test tube holders. Modeling is an extremely important skill in science, which is why we practice it a lot. First of all, again, we know that DNA is made up of nucleotides. Remember that a nucleotide has three parts. There's the sugar, which in the case of DNA is deoxyribose. There's a phosphate group, and then there's a base. We know, of course, that there are four different bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Here we can see the actual structural formula for a nucleotide. So, for instance, we can certainly see that it contains some carbons and hydrogens and oxygens, just like all the other organic compounds, but it also contains nitrogen in the base part. And so this is oftentimes referred to as a nitrogen base. And it also, in the phosphate group, we see a phosphorus atom. This is another way of showing it. Notice how the structures are. We see this ring-shaped structure, and this is showing adenine here. This is a double ring structure. We see that on this model as well, the double ring structure of adenine. Guanine also has a double ring structure, but notice how cytosine and thymine, they just have a single ring structure. But remember, adenine pairs with thymine, guanine always pairs with cytosine, so you always have a double ring pairing with a single ring. The shape of the DNA molecule is a double helix. This is one way of describing this, is a twisted ladder. And there's the molecule of DNA. Here is my model of DNA, and so we can see that typical double helix shape. But again, if I unwind it, we have what really looks like a ladder. On the sides, the black and the white squares represent the sugars and the phosphates, and then the rungs of the ladder, the steps of the ladder, are the bases. And again, this is that ladder shape. We twist it up and we have our DNA molecule shape. Another thing to take note of that Watson and Crick had to show was that nucleotides all have the same shape. So how is it that they can pair with one another? Well, if you look closely at this model, we can see that one strand of the DNA is inverted or upside down compared to the opposite strand. Scientists refer to this as the parallel strand and the antiparallel strand. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and take a look at RNA. RNA is short for ribonucleic acid. Of course, the difference here is that the sugar is ribose, not deoxyribose. The bases, for the most part, are the same. We can see that they both have cytosine, they both have guanine, adenine, but notice down here we have a few differences. It's not exactly the same molecule, is it? In DNA, it contains thymine. RNA contains uracil. So that's one of the differences between DNA and RNA. We can also take a look at the DNA molecule and the RNA molecule here. The RNA molecule only looks like it's half of the DNA molecule. So we say that it is single-stranded versus the double-stranded DNA molecule. Well, let's compare these two real quick. We'll make a Venn diagram, and we have noted that DNA is double-stranded versus RNA being single-stranded. DNA has deoxyribose as its sugar. RNA only has ribose as its sugar. DNA contains thiamine, whereas RNA has uracil. A few ways in which they're the same. Of course, the bases, adenine, cytosine, guanine, are identical in both DNA and RNA, and they both have that phosphate group that's attached. So that's the basics of the structure of DNA and RNA. In later videos, we're going to take a look at how DNA and RNA can do all the wondrous things that it does. And I can't wait to tell you about it.